John just sent a note about that, so I'm not able to tell, but I think somehow he's able to.
Okay.
Thanks.
The National Park Service defines preservation planning as the rational, systematic process by which a community develops a vision, goals, and priorities for the preservation of its historic and cultural resources. So the State Historic Preservation Office develops the Statewide Preservation Plan, not only because it's best planning practices and the state should develop goals and priorities for the preservation of its own historic and cultural resources, but because there are also some laws, regulations, and policies that dictate we do so. First is the law, Section 101B 3C of the National Preservation Act as amended. It establishes a broad mandate for SHPOs to undertake statewide preservation planning. Second are the regulations we follow, the federal procedures for state, tribal, and local government historic preservation programs. These regulations say that we must carry out a historic preservation planning process that includes the development and implementation of a comprehensive statewide historic preservation plan. And finally, there is the federal policy that our office follows in order to access federal funds. That policy is Chapter 6, Section G of the Historic Preservation Funds Grant Manual. This policy sets out certain requirements that a plan must meet in order to be approved by the National Park Service on behalf of the Secretary of the Interior. The policy is meant to ensure that meaningful public participation occurs in the planning process and that the final plan identifies issues affecting historic resources and proposes realistic solutions and sets priorities. SHPOs submit their plan to the National Park Service for review and approval. Our plan, the state of Minnesota's plan, will be submitted in October of this year for hopeful approval by January 1st of 2022. So while our office implements many of the plan's recommendations, the plan itself contains objectives that are more appropriately carried out by other entities. Everyone interested in preservation can and should adopt and implement the goals and objectives of the plan so that preservation challenges throughout the state can be met. The plan reflects views of citizens and stakeholders throughout the state who provided comment. In past plans, and their recommendations have supported the creation of the historic state tax credit and the creation of the legacy fund. And they're the foundation for all certified local government grants that are awarded. For example, in 2021, our office awarded $116,650 of grant funds that use the plan as the basis for their project ideas. Mike will talk more about how you can use the plan in your work and within your community at the end of this session. Now I'll share a little bit about our experience in working on the statewide plan and the unprecedented elements that we faced. Here's what we state in our draft plan, that in 2019, the Minnesota SHPO kicked off a collaborative process to gain public insights and examine preservation practices throughout the state. The 3-year-long planning process culminated in our 2022-2032 plan. So our new plan doesn't take effect until 2022, but wait, the old plan expires in 2017. So the reality is that due to some unprecedented challenges, the 2016 preservation planning process was put on hold and the planning effort was not actually reinvigorated until 2019. Our office ended up requesting a total of 3 extensions from the National Park Service due to unprecedented changes. These extensions provided us with the time needed to plan well during a series of challenges and changes that our office faced. First, we had leadership changes that delayed the start in 2016 and necessitated our first request for an extension. Then a legislative mandate resulted in the 2018 relocation of our office from the from the Minnesota Historical Society to the State of Minnesota Administrative Department. This necessitated another extension request. And then, as we are still all experiencing, COVID-19 altered our realities. We had shifts in our staffing capacity and changes in our ability to meet with people in person. And this actually necessitated our final extension request. And just as an aside, this year we were fortunate enough to avoid yet another setback in our planning as the state was preparing for a potential shutdown early this summer. So the plan now expires on December 31st of 2021. In creating this plan, we broke away from the State Preservation Office's usual way that earlier plans were created. Prior to this plan, the director of the State Historic Preservation Office would hire a consulting firm to do all of the engagement, which primarily consisted of listening sessions. Then our director would lock themselves away and write the plan in isolation. With new leadership and staffing changes, that process changed. While our office did hire a consultant, Minnesota's Management Analysis and Development, MAD for short, to facilitate and analyze the partner stakeholder conversations and to coordinate and evaluate the online survey, SHPO staff took a lead role in the planning and engagement processes. The State Historic Preservation Plan was developed through the hard work and coordination of an internal SHPO staff planning team. This group set plan goals, managed plan processes, and coordinated the final plan content. The planning team started by setting engagement goals to help guide who, what, and where we would reach out to the public. In the summer of 2019, all SHPO staff convened for a day-long meeting facilitated by MAD to brainstorm issues, opportunities, and threats to historic preservation in Minnesota. This brainstorming highlighted where additional research was needed and where public input was critical to fully understand the scope of preservation needs in our state. These efforts resulted in the development of engagement questions and identification of stakeholders. So again, 2 years were dedicated to public engagement by our staff. We followed the common principles of meeting people where they are and providing multiple methods for interaction. Much of the face-to-face public engagement was actually conducted by staff members and our team. And the COVID-19 pandemic halted plans to conduct additional face-to-face engagement and even squashed our big goal and dream of having a presence at the Minnesota State Fair. Even with our face-to-face efforts being cut short by COVID, we received lots of really good feedback. Here are a few examples of comments we received during our in-person and early engagement efforts. Many of the comments were about information sharing, accessibility, education, climate change, and preservation of modernism and other resources. After our face-to-face engagement plans were cut short by COVID and we started to pivot to new ideas about engagement, George Floyd was murdered, and we saw our state grieving and grappling with questions of justice. As a team, we believed a follow-up to our initial engagement was essential, but we wanted it brief and relatively open-ended so the public could tell us what they believed was important. So 2 online social media questions were asked. The first one being, looking back on the past year, how has your view of the role of historic preservation in Minnesota changed? And the second one was, looking ahead, how should diversity, equity, and inclusion be included in preservation? While we received a relatively small response to our prompts, the responses we did receive were very forward-thinking and extremely thoughtful. We received comments such as, I think diversity, equity, and inclusion should be what leads the field of preservation into the future. It needs to be at the forefront, and preservation needs to change to recognize that. And we received the comment, if our profession lacks diversity, we will continue to fail whole groups of people by undervaluing their spaces and experiences simply because we are less exposed to those spaces and people. We must respond to this call to action. So after closing out all of our engagement, we combined all the comments to create what we called some emerging themes. Here's a long list of those themes. They address topics such as economic vitality, education, regulatory framework, partnerships, information and knowledge, broadening perspectives, archaeological sites, lawmaker interest, valuing preservation, perception that old is better than new, costs and limited funds, integration into local planning, development conflicts, shortage of tradespersons and professionals, and climate change. As I stated earlier, the 2022 plan took a different path, and prior plans had the director as the sole staff person who worked on the plan, and that really did change with our plan. I've already highlighted the active role staff took in identifying stakeholders and topics for public engagement, and I shared how the planning team worked to engage with the public and direct the work of our consultants. But I would say the most impactful change with this process has been how the content was collaborated on created, debated, and authored. When we first envisioned how we were going to write this plan and pull it together, we thought we'd all be sitting in a cramped conference room writing ideas on a whiteboard. That reality has changed. When the pandemic sent all of our staff home, we struggled briefly on how to pivot. The first step was to turn the emerging themes into goals. The larger list of public engagement themes was condensed by the planning team to create 5 summary themes. They are a compilation of the public's thoughts, and they allowed us to authentically use all the great public feedback we received to inform our eventual content. We then formed small SHPO staff work teams that consisted of content experts and specialists in each of these 5 thematic areas. These small groups met online virtually a number of times to create the goals and create the objectives, and then finally create actions that would help achieve these goals. These virtual meetings were led by the planning team and were often a spirited discussion about preservation issues, actions, and desired outcomes. All public comments collected on each theme were used as resources and referred back to numerous times throughout these meetings. Within the plan, each of the goals is preceded by an introduction and an assessment of the theme. We actually had staff author these front introductions and assessments in collaboration with their small group members. The assessments include trends, data, other studies related to the goal. We found that this level of knowledge and assessment across the 5 different specialty areas was really made possible by the collaborative staff-wide approach to this plan and utilizing our content experts. And then collaboration opportunities didn't stop there. The plan has been through a number of review and comment periods and iterations. After the initial plan draft was pulled together, we distributed it to our staff for review and comment, and substantial edits were made in response to those comments. Then we shared our draft with the public and our partners. Hopefully you all had a chance to review and comment on it, and additional edits were made in response to those public comments. And then again, those edits were pushed out to our staff members who provided additional comments and edits, and we are now ready to submit our final draft to the National Park Service for review. So I mentioned that there were 5 themes. Those 5 themes eventually became our 5 goals in which our small group teams worked on. Each one of these have a series of objectives and actions that are designed to help achieve the goals. I know Mike and Leslie will be talking a little bit about a few of these goals in depth in their presentations. And I just wanted to close by saying resources and unprecedented challenges altered our timeline, our process, and most disappointingly, it didn't allow our office to connect with everyone we wanted to, and we know everyone who wanted to connect with us in this planning cycle. And because Minnesota's land mass is a pretty large area, 86,936 square miles, with a dispersed population, gathering people, building meaningful relationships, and creating an authentic presence around the state can be difficult. However, it is our intent to continue the important work of listening, meeting, and relationship building during the duration of this plan, with a focus on cultivating existing and new relationships. Staff will continue to explore the full spectrum of ways to reach out, from in-person to virtual, and we hope to continue to capitalize on opportunities to explore new connections through existing organizations, programs, and even stepping out of our standard preservation networks. With that, Leslie's going to speak to some more focused engagement that we conducted as part of this plan and our future plans for that engagement. So I am going to hand it over to her.
Thank you, Catherine. Wait to share my screen here. Are you all able to see this?
Yes, we are able to.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. I don't trust anything with all the glitches that we've had, but I think we're doing okay now. Good morning, everyone. My name is Leslie Coburn. I work in environmental review at the SHPO. I also coordinated our engagement activities with American Indian tribes to gather their input for the Statewide Historic Preservation Plan. Because of the pandemic, our outreach to the tribes was cut short, but we feel that the face-to-face conversations we had with the tribal cultural resource staff was a small step in the right direction, and certainly more of a deliberate effort to include American Indian perspectives than was done for past iterations of a statewide plan. One truth that was reinforced by this process is that there's no substitute for in-person interaction and for meeting with people on their turf, so to speak, whether it's at a community festival or someone's office or on a reservation. I'm sure this is no surprise to you, but it bears acknowledging. It may be expedient to communicate through electronic mediums, as we're doing for this conference, but it doesn't build relationships, which are so important to the preservation community and crucial to engaging with tribes. In this section of our talk, I'll cover the reasons why we made a more intensive effort to include tribal viewpoints in the plan, how we conducted our outreach to tribes, and what we've learned from talking with tribal staff and from the experience. Why are we emphasizing tribal perspectives for the plan? Well, because Minnesota's history includes over 13,000 years of Indigenous occupation. We have evidence of this history in the state's archaeological record, burial sites, and traditional cultural landscapes. Historic preservation planning activities for these properties include context studies, identification, and evaluation of properties, and registration. We rely on Native peoples, both in-state and out-of-state, to help identify significant traditional properties and provide context for them. Therefore, it's important that Native people be included in a comprehensive state planning process. Another reason to include tribal voices is because of the increasing recognition that large-scale projects in Minnesota can have a significant negative impact on cultural resources. Such projects include wind farms, roads, mining operations that not only impact archaeological sites, but sacred places and traditional hunting and harvesting locations. Project planners in both the public and private sectors need to be aware that such places exist and to consult with tribes when there is a possibility that cultural resources may be harmed. Although Minnesota's Native population is only about 1% of the total, its 11 tribes are sovereign nations, self-governing, and holding the same clout as that of federal and state governments. This sets them apart from other underrepresented communities in Minnesota and affords tribes and a government-to-government relationship with the state of Minnesota. And the state government is increasingly recognizing its responsibility to consult with tribes on matters that affect them, and certainly a preservation plan affects them. Some of you may remember that for the last iteration of the plan, SHPO was located within the Minnesota Historical Society, not within state government. Now that SHPO is housed within the Minnesota Department of Administration, our efforts to reach out to tribes followed the state's more formal process than for other historically underrepresented groups. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. There were several groups we hoped to reach out to, and we experienced different degrees of success, in large part because of time constraints and limited staff capacity. Our primary focus was on reaching out to the 11 federally recognized tribes with reservations in Minnesota. 7 of the reservations are Anishinaabe, also called Chippewa or Ojibwe, located in the northern half in green on the map. and 4 are Dakota or Sioux in red in the southern half. Each tribe has staff that manage cultural resources. None but one have a Tribal Historic Preservation Office, or THPO, which is the equivalent of the SHPO on the reservations. In February and March 2020, we were able to meet in person at the offices of 4 of the THPOs: White Earth, Leech Lake, Red Lake, and Upper Sioux. That's 3 Ojibwe and 1 Dakota. Then the pandemic hit, and we were unable to meet with the rest. To identify tribes with current and ancestral interest in Minnesota, we used the Tribal Directory Assessment Tool, which was developed by the Office of Environment and Energy. For example, the traditional lands of the Flandreau Santee Sioux tribe, based in South Dakota, extend into Minnesota. And in addition, we included Rainy River First Nations in Canada because of its interests in the burial site Grand Mound near International Falls. Our outreach to out-of-state tribes was limited. We sent them links to the survey Catherine mentioned earlier and to the draft of the plan for comment. The Minnesota Indian Affairs Council is a state agency that is designed to protect the sovereignty of the Minnesota tribes and to advise and influence state policy. Board members consist of leaders from the 11 tribes, and non-voting board members include commissioners of state departments. The greatest number of American Indians in Minnesota live in urban areas, not on reservations. The Twin Cities, Bemidji, Duluth. This group proved to be the most challenging to formulate an engagement strategy for. We were advised that there is consultation fatigue, an overabundance of requests to seek input. In order to alleviate some of this pressure, we were told, the city of Minneapolis hired a consultant to engage with community members and conduct further research to create a Native American context report. We referenced this report, but we didn't find a way to conduct specific outreach to urban Indians for the plan. Now, the state of Minnesota has formalized a process for state agencies to consult and coordinate with tribes on policy issues. To initiate our conversations with the tribes for the plan, we loosely followed this procedure. This graphic shows the hierarchy of the framework for consultation at the state. Starting at the very top, soon after taking office, Governor Walz issued an executive order directing state agencies to consult with tribes on matters that concern them. Previous governors had issued similar executive orders. Now, under that, Commissioner Alice Roberts Davis issued a tribal nations consultation policy for the Department of Administration, and SHPO's in the department. This policy spells out how the department will consult on issues with tribes, and notably, Commissioner Roberts Davis is also the State Historic Preservation Officer. In the case of the plan, Commissioner Roberts Davis sent a letter to Minnesota tribal chairs in fall 2019 to introduce the plan and our wish to gather input from the tribal members. And under that, the department's consultation policy provides for a tribal liaison, which is Assistant Commissioner Kurt Yoakum. He holds that title. His role is to be the point person for identification of issues, coordinate consultation with the tribes. Members of the planning team met with Kurt early on to discuss logistics of engagement, as well as how we might sensitively conduct that outreach. The team has kept him apprised of our engagement activities throughout the process. Finally, at the division level, Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer Amy Spong introduced the plan to the board of the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council that we saw earlier. Now, we were still in person at that time, and she expressed our interest in engaging in conversations with tribes. Now, remember, this council consists of tribal chairs and state commissioners. The core team that was chosen to make in-person visits to tribal historic preservation offices is also SHPO's environmental review team. We review projects under state historic preservation laws as well as under federal law, called Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Under that federal law, federal agencies must take into account the effects of projects they carry out or financially assist. Besides needing to consult with the SHPO, federal agencies must also consult with tribes that attach religious and cultural significance to those properties that could be affected. And besides, the SHPO and TIPOs might review a project concurrently. They're often in communication with one another about effects to historic properties. The environmental review team, therefore, has the most interaction with tribes of all SHPO staff, and it was the obvious choice for tribal engagement for the plan. Let's digress for just a minute because it's important to understand the SHPO's role in protecting historic properties that are significant to tribes when those properties are located off reservations and therefore not under the purview of the tribal historic preservation offices. When a project such as a mine is proposed for an area that is not within a reservation, it's the SHPO that either agrees that no historic properties will be affected or that a formal agreement must be drawn up to memorialize how any adverse effects will be minimized or mitigated. The tribes may be consulted and may or may not be invited to sign the agreement, but ultimately the SHPO carries the weight of the environmental review response for projects off the reservations. Sometimes it gets political. This is the reason it's important for the SHPO and TIPOs to nurture their partnership and be in close communication. Here's what we learned from our conversations with tribal cultural resource staff and from our engagement process. There were several issues the TIPOs identified as important. Education about American Indian history, sacred sites, and traditional cultural landscapes is needed. This is both for tribal members and for non-Native people. The next one is one that really stood out to us. We heard repeated a number of times. Preserving cultural heritage and resources is essential for a sense of Native American identity. It's crucial for their physical and mental well-being. There's a shortage of funding for staff, for facilities, for technology, and better management of culturally sensitive data is needed. Development pressures threaten important places. There needs to be more consultation and early consultation with tribes and acknowledgement that certain sites have tribal significance. And more tribal survey is needed as well, along with context studies to help identify those resources. Here's what we learned about the engagement process with tribes. It's important to build trust, have an open, inclusive process, balance Dakota and Ojibwe input that you receive, be aware of the difference between Dakota and Ojibwe traditions, and keep a fair balance when representing input from the tribes. Be aware of consultation fatigue. Many organizations right now are requesting conversations with tribes. The tribes are understaffed, and your request to consult may be delayed or ignored. Don't take this personally. And finally, some things that we did right. We reached out to our counterparts at the tribes, similar roles within our respective governments. We also used SHPO staff that already had a history of interactions with tribes. We met in person at their offices on the reservations. Meeting face-to-face was very important. We sent a list of questions in advance to help the TIPO staff prepare for our visit but we made it clear that our discussion did not need to be limited to just the questions we sent. We sent 3 SHPO staff per visit. 1 to ask the questions, maintain the conversation, 1 to take notes, and 1 backup person to help facilitate. We chose not to electronically record the visits because we felt that it could be too intrusive and inhibit conversation. We did take a camera, but this photo with the Upper Sioux SHPO was the only post photo we took, and frankly, that felt awkward. We're awfully glad to have this photo, but it made us a little bit uncomfortable. We also took a basket of snacks to the meeting. This seemed appropriate as both a gift and for meeting refreshments rather than arrive empty-handed, especially because we were gifts. We were guests. And then there was the pandemic. By mid-March 2020, we had to give up the remaining in-person visits we had scheduled. The following August, our team reached out to the tribes we hadn't met with. This was when we realized there probably was no getting together in person before our plan was due. We offered alternative ways to give us their feedback by phone, by video conference, or email. None responded to these suggestions, which isn't surprising under the circumstances. And likewise, both Minnesota and out-of-state tribes were invited to comment on the draft plan, but we didn't hear from them. The 4 TPOs we had met with received a draft of just the section of the plan summarizing the tribal engagement, and we did receive some comments from them and incorporated them. While it was disappointing to have to end our visits with the tribes, we are extremely grateful for the opportunity to meet with those who did and to have such open conversations. It underscores the importance of face-to-face interactions, and we hope to continue those conversations when it's safe to do so. Finally, we reviewed the feedback we received from the TPOs and formulated some action items for the plan. Some of those spoke to other underrepresented communities, such as developing historic contexts in cooperation with those communities, but others were specific to TPOs. If you attended last year's Preserve Minnesota conference, you may remember the session about planning for Indian Mounds Regional Park in St. Paul. That included Cheyenne St. John of Lower Sioux and other panelists. They emphasized the native concept of the interconnectedness of things. People, land, water, sky, animals, they all exist together as part of a system, and therefore planning should be holistic and comprehensive. We took this to heart, and we chose to incorporate action items regarding tribal historic preservation throughout the goals of the plan, rather than relegating them all under the theme of diversity and inclusion. Now, I'll quickly go through the goals and specific action items that resulted from our conversation. Goal 1 was about partnerships and connections. This is strengthening preservation partnerships and communication among and with tribes. Goal 2 is about expanding and sharing information, identification and sharing data on places of tribal significance. Diversity and inclusion, of course, is about bringing more voices to the table and broadening the stories about places listed in the National Register. Goal 4, economic benefits and funding. We could all use this, increasing access to grants and financial support. Goal 5, sustainability, recognizing the effects of climate change on traditional landscapes. Now, I realize we went through these goal slides really quickly, and I encourage you to read the plan in greater depth if you haven't already done so. Thank you for attending a session on a Friday. Now I'll turn it over to Mike Koop, who will talk about ways to implement the plan in your communities.
I have handed over presentation rights to you, Mike. Leslie, you've done a wonderful job coordinating our tribal engagement. We really have
Thank
been
you.
fortunate to have you as part of the team.
Thank you, Catherine.
Mike, we can see your presentation.
Great. Okay, well, thanks, Leslie, for that wonderful presentation, and Catherine for the terrific lead in. And so now that everybody has heard about how the plan was actually created and what some of our public engagement efforts included, I want to very, very briefly talk about how you can use the plan and how you can make the plan work for the organization that you're involved with. I have only 10 slides, and this is by design. I wanted to keep this quite brief, in part because, as Leslie just said, you know, she went through the 5 goals very quickly, and my goal is not to have all of the goals referenced in my presentation. I'm only going to touch on a couple, and that's intentional because, kind of echoing what Leslie said, I want you to go into the plan and look at it and read through it and find how you and your organization can identify with it. So one way you can use the plan and can demonstrate your support for it is to have your organization pass a resolution to formally adopt the plan. This is sort of like when you declare May as Preservation Month and have a proclamation signed by your mayor, for instance. If you serve on a preservation commission, this can be initiated by the HPC and formally approved by the unit of government that you live in, typically a city, but also it could apply to a township or even a county level application. And this may seem like, you know, kind of a no-brainer, a small gesture, if you will, but it really does carry a lot of meaning and significance. So I would encourage you to consider doing that. So I'm assuming you can see my next slide, paged forward. So as I said, if this idea of adopting the plan for your organization seems like a small gesture, it really actually carries a lot of weight. It makes a statement that preservation matters in your community. You're sort of emphasizing the point that, you know, preservation provides a tangible benefit to the residents where you live. It improves the quality of life for your community. These are all important points that I think we need to reinforce, whether we're talking to our neighbor or to a city council member or you know, anybody who's interested in listening to us. So this is an interesting map, something new that has been prepared actually for our new plan, and I want to give a nod of thanks to Nicole Foss, who prepared this map. What you're looking at is it's a distribution of where the Heritage Preservation Commissions and certified local governments are located throughout the state. So the red dots indicate certified local government. The blue triangles are referencing a Heritage Preservation Commission, and the green shading represents a county where an HPC or a CLG is located. That doesn't mean that the green itself is part of a local preservation program. It just so happens that, so in St. Louis County, for instance, you have several different communities that have either a commission or a certified local government. The county itself is not officially part of the program. But in any case, I wanted to show this map because the new plan supports the day-to-day work that you, I'm sort of speaking to you collectively as if you're wearing the hat of a member of an HPC, for instance. And in particular, it supports the fundamental roles that HPCs play, that the certified local governments are involved with in their communities, particularly regarding kind of the 4 fundamental program areas that relate to, you know, preservation, stemming even from the federal level, you know, down through the state and local communities, that reference identifying, evaluating, designating, and protecting historic resources, you know, within your local community. So it goes without saying, as I've kind of hinted already, that In our opinion, all the HPCs and CLGs across the state should include the new plan in their objectives and activities that they're doing as it pertains to these four sort of pillars of activity that you're involved with. We really, really want your community, your municipal government, whatever it might be, to work in partnership with us at SHPO and commit to these initiatives if you are so inclined. So I want to take a minute to talk about several, and then we'll refer back to these four foundational program areas. The first of which relates to identification of the historic resources, and all of that information when we are identifying the properties in the state goes into a statewide inventory that we maintain in our office. And some of you have been in our office and gone through the files and seen what we have. So the map you're looking at, another one created by Nicole, is representing all the different resources, numerically represented by county. And you can see that the southeast and the central parts of the state are disproportionately represented here. So although the inventory has grown substantially in the past decade, kind of going back to when that previous plan that Catherine referenced was completed, really only a small percentage of the state has been surveyed. And so and on top of that, I think in the case for a lot of us who live within, say, the 7-county metro area or close to that, perhaps even more importantly, although many of the state's urbanized areas have been surveyed to some degree, a lot of that survey data is 30 years old or even older than that. And in terms of preservation work that we do, survey information that is that old is really, really dated, and it needs to be updated. So again, whether you're a resident of a community, if you wear the hat of a preservation commissioner, whatever it might be, you can use this information like from this map, and you can allow that to sort of bolster your case and making the argument to whoever you're speaking to, whether it's a county representative or a city councilor or to the entire council, maybe the mayor, whoever it might be that you feel you need to convince that we need to do a better job identifying the resources in our community. You can point to the fact that, in many cases, we are lacking good information about these resources. And the same holds if you are a staff member working within a city, whether you're a planner or staff to the HPC itself, and maybe you need to convince the city council or your supervisor, for instance, that you need to apply for a grant to do additional survey work. This is the kind of information from the plan that you'll be able to use to bolster that argument that we need to do a better job of increasing the level of survey across the state. And along those lines, Leslie kind of touched on this a little bit. We know that we need to expand our thinking about the kinds of resources that we have previously identified and tried to preserve. It's kind of a wake-up call, I guess, if you will, for our office, but for others as well. And that's why goal 2 in the new plan includes an action to, quote, encourage identification and protection of historic and archaeological sites, cultural landscapes, traditional cultural properties, and sacred sites throughout Minnesota on and off tribal lands, including on federal lands. So, in this case, whether it's a mound group like in St. Paul or wild rice wild ricing on lakes, whether it's on Mille Lacs or up in Monoman County at White Earth, it doesn't matter. Those are sacred sites for the Native Americans, but they're also sites that we need to learn a lot more about in our own office and identify, the locations and also whether there is potential cultural significance so that they could be recognized and potentially even listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Moving on in terms of again, kind of referring back to those 4 pillars, once properties have been identified, after they've been evaluated, we love to be able to recognize them in some manner, designating them. So Prince Honeycutt was Fergus Falls' first African-American resident. You see his house on the left, which was built in 1885. And that's Mr. Honeycutt standing on the right in front of his barber shop in downtown Fergus Falls. The barber shop no longer stands, unfortunately. However, his house does still stand, and it's in relatively good condition. It's not been altered a great deal. And that's why the Fergus Falls HPC, to their credit, is currently looking into the idea of designating the Honeycutt house through either local designation, using the city's preservation ordinance, or through the National Register of Historic Places. And the HPC's intentions fit directly within an objective under Goal 3 in the new plan that deals with fostering inclusion and specifically calls for increasing the number of National Register listings and local landmark designations of resources associated with underrepresented communities. Both Catherine and Leslie have touched on this already. So in this case, if the city intends to proceed with this, and I think that they will, and they want to apply for, say, a certified local government grant, or another source of funding, say from the National Park Service, to pursue designation either locally or the National Register, I think it'll be very easy for the commission and the city to make the case that this is a worthy project that they should be able to pursue, in part because it falls squarely within at least one of the goals, if not more than one, from the new plan. Moving on from designation, another important task for a local preservation commission, but more broadly to residents that are concerned about preservation, is to actually protect the resources. And that can be done in a number of different ways. So I think it's appropriate, our host city for the conference, Stillwater, is a really good example where they recognized some years ago that they were really lacking a fairly meaty, meaningful preservation component. Their comp plan was somewhat out of date, and they wanted to find a way to codify preservation within the new comp plan that they were going to be working on. So they embarked on this effort to actually create and write a preservation chapter within the city's comp plan. Now, the project is already completed. It was just done this year. But for the sake of discussion, let's say that this actually hadn't taken place and the city were to approach me next year and they wanted to apply for a CLG grant to do something like this. Again, this is exactly the kind of thing that we would support. We'd love to have cities do this, particularly relating to creating preservation chapters and comp plans or something equivalent, so that the cultural resources, the historic resources are identified more accurately and referenced within a comp plan, so that the other departments within a city, whether it's the planning department or zoning or permits, are aware that preservation is important to that community. And again, if the city wanted to apply for a CLG grant to produce this kind of a document, then we would fully support it, and it would be easy to tie back to the new plan how the objectives of getting a preservation chapter done for a comp plan would relate to one or more of the goals in the new plan. Kind of stepping outside the bounds of those four fundamental pillars, if you will, a lot of communities that I work with deal with taking on education and interpretation projects, and it could be something as simple as the age-old, let's produce a walking tour brochure or some kind of a print piece. But a lot of cities have gone well beyond that. And, many HPCs that are certified local governments have undertaken these projects that really help educate the public about preservation in a very broad sense, but also much more specifically and appropriately about the significance of the historic resources that they have in their own community. Again, These are really, really popular projects that we love supporting with CLG grants. And so depending on how the application is actually written, I think it will be very easy for the applicant to be able to tie back to the new plan and the fact that there are going to be multiple goals. There will be several action items and objectives that tie into this whole notion of educating public about the resources that the community has. Goal 1 of the plan is to facilitate connections and cultivate partnerships. We've referenced that a few times already. And this includes an action to assist Minnesota's HPCs and certified local governments to strengthen their preservation programs and equip them with tools to address current challenges and to improve the HPC sort of information sharing network, if you will. And one way to accomplish this, we know this already, is that a lot of the commissions are using the training manual that was done in 2016, paid for with, in part, a CLG grant. We also can provide training and education for the commissions, for others, through the CAMP, the Commission Assistance Mentoring Program that's offered by the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions. Some of you perhaps sat in on the 2 days, the 4 sessions that we offered for CAMP on Tuesday and Wednesday of this week. And the question always comes up, well, how are we supposed to pay for these kinds of things? And I've already mentioned it multiple times. The CLG grants are the way to go with this. And again, when those applications are prepared, there's a specific question in that application where the applicant needs to respond to how that project, how the proposal ties in with the statewide preservation plan. And these are the kinds of initiatives, these kinds of projects are pretty easy to, and they will be very easy to connect to the goals, objectives, and actions within the newly written plan. So we interact obviously at SHPO with a lot of different organizations, affiliate groups, stakeholders, partners across the entire state who work in some capacity with preservation of historic and cultural resources. I've identified some on the screen here, but there are many, many others that I didn't put up. Maybe you wear the hat of one of those organizations. My point is, it would be appropriate for all of these organizations to incorporate the new plan into their work as well. And we hope that that'll happen. And finally, no matter where you call home, we hope that you'll be able to use the new plan to inform your work and make your jobs easier when you seek funds to support all the activities for promoting preservation in your community. So with that, I am going to close my presentation, and we are well ahead of schedule, so I think we can open it up for questions and so forth, right, Catherine?
Yes, it looks like we have 15 minutes of question time. We've actually received a number of questions through chat, so not everyone can see them, so I'll read them out loud and we can answer them as a panel. The first question is, will a draft sent to the National Park Service be available online to the public? And the answer to that is yes. It's currently being proofread. And then it will go to a designer for layout. And at that time, it should be in a good draft form that we will post it on our webpage. Unfortunately, we won't be able to accept any additional comments because concurrently we'll be sending it to the National Park Service for their review. We have a question, does SHPO have a draft resolution? Mike, do we have any draft resolutions to assist communities who want to adopt portions of the plan?
I love that question because the short answer is no, we don't. And I actually was thinking about that over the last number of days when I was working on the presentation, because I started to look and I was sort of checking some websites through, say, the League of Minnesota Cities and the state, and I didn't find anything, but I don't think it would be difficult, given that our department is within the Department of Administration, that we would be able to create a resolution. I think that would be a pretty easy lift. So we can definitely work on that.
All right, and then we have another question. Let's see, as the draft plan is in review by National Park Service, what is its legal standing as a guide for HPCs and CLGs?
Well, I think right now, and Catherine and Leslie, feel free to weigh in on this. You know, as Catherine noted, the current plan that we're still operating under is in effect until the end of this calendar year. And so I think I would probably want to check with the National Park Service regarding the status of the version, the draft that they will be reviewing. But my assumption is that by January 1 of the new calendar year, we will have a new plan formally adopted. So we would be able to refer to that. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think, and the asker is more than welcome to clarify if you would like. I think part of the question is when it is approved by the National Park Service, then does it have some legal standing for the HPCs and the CLGs? I would assume that local communities will need to adopt portions or all of the plan through a resolution in order for it to have some legal standing within their own community, correct?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
All right, we have a question that came in on the Q&A, and please feel free to enter more questions on the Q&A. And if you'd like to try to ask one verbally, I am more than happy to try to allow some of our participants, our attendees here today, to ask their questions. Just shoot me in the Q&A your name, and I can then, it looks like, release you for asking a question verbally. Anyway, this question is, the goals are very worthy, yet how will the goals be periodically evaluated to determine how well the goals are being met? And I can field this from the State Historic Preservation Office. So there will be at the 5-year mark, we will be doing an evaluation of our progress towards the goals of the 10-year plan. That's something that we'll be doing kind of more on the statewide level. Within our office itself, we'll be utilizing this plan to guide our work on a yearly basis, as we would expect our partners and those who work in preservation throughout the state to be doing so. So the onus is on all individual organizations utilizing the plan to navigate through their work in preservation, to really take the time on a yearly basis to check in and see how they are doing in achieving some of the actions and working towards achieving the goals. So Leslie, Mike, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Go ahead, Leslie.
No, I was going to say, I think that was well said, Catherine.
Well, one thing I can elaborate on that Catherine alluded to is that when the current plan was done, we were required to include a section that was a sort of an assessment of activities that occurred from the previous plan moving forward, and how we, you know, how did we do as far as accomplishing what those goals were. And when I was writing that, and when we were getting input from our colleagues about it, it was easy to find references to things that SHPO itself was involved with, as well as, say, the HPCs and organizations that we, you know, interact with very closely. What I found, though, was that there were gaps, and there were moments when it would have been nice to know more about what was happening elsewhere. And so, to Catherine's point, I think it's going to be incumbent on you folks out there to make sure that we know what's going on so that we can assess the success of the goal that we have. And as Catherine mentioned, we do have that 5-year mark that's sort of a benchmark to look at, you know, how far have we come? It's, you know, kind of a check-in, if you will, because the previous plan was only a 5-year plan. We're doubling that now in length. So we need to have that check-in to make sure what's our progress look like. But my main point is that we really need help from all of you, the members of the public, all the other organizations that we work with, to find out about what's been going on. and to be able to assess our progress.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Mike. One of the components of our ongoing work to continually engage with our partners and those interested in preservation will be to make that process easier, to engage with you more frequently throughout the life of the plan, to hear how your community is working to achieve the goals and to kind of keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening statewide.
Catherine?
And if you would like to ask a question in person, just shoot me your name in the Q&A and I will unmute you. Otherwise, please do feel free to submit questions in the Q&A or the chat function. Amy, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Amy Spong with the State Historic Preservation Office. Everything that Mike and Catherine answered in the last question, and then also with the legal standing, one thing I wanted to add is specifically for SHPO, the preservation plan is very much tied to our federal funding. And so we do a very robust reporting. We're required to do very robust reporting at the end of every federal fiscal year of all of our activities and how do they fit with the adopted statewide historic preservation plan. So, and if any of you were attending maybe the yesterday's session with Megan Brown from the Grants Division at the Park Service, she talked about how there's, you know, the National Historic Preservation Act sets up this federal, state, local partnership with CLGs and HPCs. So we have these agreements with CLGs and HPCs. And so we're, you know, that's that partnership, and it all kind of ties back into the activities that are noted in the preservation plan. So just wanted to mention that.
We have a request to ask a question in person, so I'm going to give this a try. Go ahead, you should be able to ask your question. Christine.
Leslie, are you directing that to me?
Yes.
Thank you. This is Christine Schultz. I chair the HPC in Rochester, Minnesota. And essentially two questions. Following up on the questions on the draft plan. So from what I was understanding, it seems in January is when we would seek adopting a resolution if a city and an HPC are interested, that to initiate adopting that resolution would not be appropriate until January?
That would be correct. The plan itself will go into effect January 1st once it receives approval from the National Park Service.
Okay, thank you. I have two real quick things, Leslie. Would that be okay?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, one would just be a comment which I made in the chat is that please take care in terms of numbers. Michael, the counties were represented in terms of different properties that have, that are being considered or have been considered. And again, in terms of parity throughout the state, the population in those counties, I think also needs to be given, because the numbers, county to county are not apples to apples, in terms of densely populated areas. So that would just be a comment. The other question I have is very broad, and that is this session and many sessions have focused on the importance of cultural heritage resources. It strikes me, and I know it's actually something of interest in Rochester, is it is quite difficult to get people with heritage programs in cities and developed areas where the pattern of development is more built, and they recognize history as being focused on buildings. It's very difficult to even for a building to have them talk about the cultural heritage importance of building. And Rochester is facing that in some things that I'll talk with some people who have been in these conferences later. How do you believe this state plan will assist local HPCs and CLGs in strengthening people's understanding of the importance of culture in a heritage resource? Is that an understandable question?
Yeah, I think so. And I guess the way that I would answer it, and I would hope Catherine and Leslie might want to weigh in as well, would be to say that we've sort of hinted that the process of engagement and the way that we thought about creating the new plan, we tried to be much more inclusive and broad in our thinking about the definition of historic and cultural resources. And so I think compared to what we've done in the past, hopefully this new plan will open the door to being able to have conversations about the types of resources that you're describing, and being able to use the document as a way to convince people that, you know, we're not just talking about 4 walls and a roof of a building and that's it. You know, there's greater intent behind what that resource represents, and the plan hopefully reflects that. Catherine, I don't know if you want to attempt to elaborate on that.
In addition to that, I would say working on a statewide plan that is used by communities throughout the state with all of their specificity and uniqueness is kind of a very broad umbrella that we've created. And hopefully the idea, and Mike has alluded to this, is that it empowers local communities to identify those pieces of cultural heritage that is important and cultural resources that are important to their community, and take the measures and steps that will work within their community to best protect and celebrate those resources. You know, I think of some communities on the national level who have identified things like legacy businesses and have taken steps to retain those legacy businesses within their communities. So we're hopeful that the plan gives everyone the foundation and the structure and the scaffolding needed to enact those measures that work best for their communities to protect those resources.
One thing that I might add is that sometimes HPCs don't really have archaeological site potential in mind. They look at their built environment when they think about what their historic properties are. So our National Register archaeologist, David Mather, has really been wanting to encourage more archaeological surveying, more HPCs to pursue that. And, you know, he would be willing to speak with your HPCs as well if you think you might have an interest in that. And if there may be areas in your community that should be investigated that way.
Going back to
your questions.
Well, I was just going to add that going back to the question about whether our office has a draft resolution that we can offer. Just a moment ago, I got an email from Erin Hannafenberg, who's the policy director with Rethos, and she attached in her email an example of a draft resolution that Rethos had been using during the initiative to reinstate or extend the state historic tax credit. So I'll take a look at that, and you know, we'll use that certainly to craft something that we can share with everybody. So thanks, Erin, for sending that.
Thank you, Erin. Are there any other questions or items that people would like to share with our panelists? Just trying to see if anyone else has submitted a request to be unmuted. I am not seeing any. Again,
Challenging to have to check all the different options, the questions, the chat, the request to be unmuted. I know it's.
Yes, I'm not seeing any additional requests or questions. And with that, I think we can wrap up our presentation. We're right at time, 10:15. Thank you so much for attending and for asking these really good questions. We're looking forward to working with you all on putting this plan into effect and working hard on achieving some of the goals that we've set forth. Again, this presentation will be shared on through a link that will be shared with you as an individual registrant of the presentation. Leslie or Mike, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, just thank you to everyone for sitting through our session and hearing about the plan.
Likewise, and thanks for coming to the conference and helping make it a success. It's the final day, so it's a wrap.
Have a wonderful weekend, all.